Cool. All right. Hi, everyone. This is the Kubernetes SIG Cloud Provider biweekly meeting. Today is Wednesday, July 11th. It is 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, so I think our agenda is fairly short today. I don't think we'll take the full hour. Most of the updates are actually just kind of follow-up items from last week or 3 weeks ago. So I'll start with kind of the first thing on the list, which is the KEP that we had opened to introduce end-to-end conformance testing from all the providers. So for anyone that hasn't been to the SIG meetings, this is just a KEP proposing why and how cloud providers should be reporting end-to-end tests to kind of a centralized place, which is TestGrid. So TestGrid is pretty much kind of the testing infrastructure that runs on Google Cloud Platform right now that kind of stores all the various test results that we're kind of running in the Kubernetes ecosystem. So the KEP is just outlining like what set of tests that we think is good enough to run right now for all the, like what kind of tests we expect from all the providers and kind of like what tools to use to do that. So with the KEP merged, I think there's a bit more, I think guidance on how to get this done is a bit more clear. And I think we can kind of start pushing forward for this effort a bit more aggressively. So I kind of wanted to talk about with the SIG on what we think is a reasonable deadline to start having all the providers reporting these tests on a regular basis. I was thinking 1.12 release is pretty reasonable deadline for all the providers to be reporting at least like the base conformance tests. Anyone have any opinions or thoughts on this?
Do you have the date of 1.12 release off the top of your head?
Yeah, I think it's September, end of September.
Gotcha. Cool, that works for us.
Cool.
I think one thing that's a little unclear still to me is if we have guidance or recommendations on whether this is on every commit or if this is on a scheduled basis 4 times a day, or what this group would feel is reasonable for that.
For context, OpenStack is doing this on every commit.
Yeah,
based on their cloud provider.
Yeah, I think the ideal place to be is every commit. But I think in the KEP, we had said that every patch version is also okay, just because, you know, infrastructure costs and kind of the overhead of operating CI for every single Kubernetes commit might be a bit too much to ask up front. And so, yeah, I think as a kind of smaller step approach is bare minimum report tests for patch release. And then maybe when we're kind of more experienced in this, we can start expecting every commit out of master.
Great. And do we have a good? Sorry, do we have a good sense of how we get GCP buckets for this too, or is there going to be an update to the testing infrastructure to allow people to bring their own buckets? Yeah. So in the KEP, it pretty much says to ping Ben on SIG testing. He said he's okay with that. So this kind of is like, that's pretty much what we're going to do for now. I don't know. Maybe in the future, there might be a better way to do this. Like people can kind of bring their own publicly readable S3 buckets or whatnot. But right now, it is to ask Ben for a GCP bucket owned by the CNCF.
I think today you can bring your own GCP buckets if you choose to.
Yeah, it is. Yes, it is any publicly readable GCP bucket, and for pretty much every provider except for Google Cloud. Like if you don't have access to free like buckets or whatever, then you would ask them.
And can I ask? You said deadline. What is the consequence of not meeting the deadline?
I don't know. I don't know. So like this is kind of what I struggle with a bit. Is like how do we kind of push so many people to do something, especially in the open source community. I don't know. I feel like as long as we're recording some sort of deadline showing that like, hey, we want to meet these goals, and we all kind of agreed to do it, that's like good enough. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
It's at least a target. There's also a lot of overlap with the conformance working group, and there's something like 60 certified Kubernetes providers that we're also encouraging to use test results of the conformance test suite back to test grid. So I think the folks who are actively working on cloud provider extraction or evolution are highly incentivized already. I don't think we need a stick or a consequence to not meeting that. It's really just about trying to come up with a reasonable target so people have to implement.
A suggestion also might be, though, to put it in, if there's some docs or a list of cloud providers, if you're not reporting your E2E tests by some deadline, just don't put them in there. And the reason is it's both a carrot, but also it avoids having to curate a list where anyone can just submit something. And it's sort of hard to say no without a reason, and the list just balloons otherwise. Any list will grow to infinity in Kubernetes.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, sounds good. So I guess tentatively we'll set 112 as kind of the deadline, and we'll just go from there. Hopefully everyone kind of has enough of a reason to push for that. And if they don't, again, not much we can do, but I guess we can, again, like as Justin said, we can kind of set standards on like how we like list providers based on whether they report tests or not.
I also spoke with Mitra and Aish and Ben about creating a dedicated dashboard for the cloud provider effort so that we can have like one top level test result for each commit for each cloud provider. So each cloud provider would get a row, the goal of which is to surface early if work on one area, someone's testing on one cloud provider and inadvertently breaks all the others. Oh, Ben's got something in the chat. Maybe. Oh, there's already a conformance all. Look at that. You click in the chat.
Sorry, it's close to what you're talking about.
Real time. So I think that there may be value in having just one other view into this for the cloud providers specifically. And this would be more focused on the conformance working group and the platforms and distributions doing their own CI/CD. Maybe that's the same set of tests for the cloud providers, but may just be another view into the data.
Makes sense. Cool. Okay. Yeah, so I'll add that to my notes. So we make sure we talk about that when we're a bit further ahead on this. Okay, is Nishi on the call yet? She's not. Okay, so I'll push the doc updates a bit back. She says she's running a bit late. Next on the list is another KEP. I feel like these SIG meetings are just me talking about KEPs. It's great. So this KEP was merged last week. Essentially, it's just a template for new providers. So I've had people from Alibaba Cloud, Baidu Cloud, DigitalOcean, which is where I work, IBM Cloud, and Oracle kind of reach out, wanting concrete ways to propose new providers into the ecosystem. One of the biggest benefits is having those Kubernetes org-owned repos that they can host their code in. So these are kind of the cloud providers right now that are kind of making those proposals right now in progress. So whenever they have those KEPs open, we'll kind of make sure we talk about it in the SIG meetings, make sure that all the requirements set out are met, and then from there we can kind of go forward with creating whatever repos we need and whatnot. Any questions there? So like kind of going alongside the end-to-end discussion, we can probably add end-to-end tests. Like later down the road when we have a better idea of how end-to-end tests are going to work, we can add one of those as requirements for the new providers, like Justin said. Cool. All right, Chris, do you want to give an update on the state of cluster API now?
Yeah, totally. Can you guys hear me okay? Cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, I figured I would give like a really quick high level update and then let folks ask questions if they want. Cause you know, I'm here to help you folks out any way I can. And then I guess, you know, we'll go from there. The cluster API is basically a declarative way of mutating and managing Kubernetes clusters. So this is going to be managing the infrastructure layer, but managing bits and pieces that are not necessarily under the scope of the cloud provider as it stands today. So these are going to be things like creating machines and configuring machines and like configuring the cloud init for these machines as we're bringing them up, and then making sure that there's a happy number of them running accordingly. So we started this project earlier last year. It was myself and some folks from Google, and now it's turned into a working group under SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We have some code that's currently in alpha. We have the API that's running as an aggregated API, and we have a couple of controller implementations, one of which the OpenStack controller is, what's going to be the OpenStack controller is linked below. And we're currently working on AWS. Google has an implementation out there already. So it kind of falls in the same scope of like multiple cloud providers, but solving a very different problem than what the actual traditional cloud providers are solving, and does it in a declarative way. So that's an effort that's been ongoing for a while, and there's probably some overlap, and we should probably start to work closely as our project matures with you folks here to make sure that like we're working as harmoniously and as complementary as possible along the way. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Anything about the philosophy behind the project all the way to technical detail.
Thanks for coming and sharing, Chris. I appreciate it. I have spoken with some folks here about the cluster API, so I have some perspective from the Google folks who have been working on it. But I am interested to hear sort of trending directions on what is the scope and limits of the cluster API as currently understood by Cluster Lifecycle SIG. I don't participate in that SIG and don't know that part of it. Some examples would be like, is the health of a cluster part in scope? Is that something we would consider as part of the cluster API or?
Totally. So I think the boundary, and this is like, we haven't like written this down anywhere. So this is just sort of my opinion of the consensus of the working group as it stands today. But the boundary is basically at the machine and infrastructure layer. So we don't really concern ourselves with the health of the Kubernetes software, like any of the Kubernetes components that run on top of the infrastructure. We're concerned with the health of the infrastructure. You know, is the node happy? And things that would make a node happy would be things like, does it have, you know, available memory? Is CPU available? Is it, you know, is software running? And if the software is running, then we sort of like stop there. And then, you know, there's a whole other set of checks and balances for, is the software actually going to be doing what we expect it to do? And then really it kind of boils down to machines. Like we have two main components. We have a cluster, which is like the actual definition of the cluster components, which is just basically a lazy declarative way of saying, I want to run, you know, Kubernetes version in. And then we have a machine, which is can be also thought of as a set of machines, which just describes, you know, the size of the machine, maybe how we provision the machine, and you know, some networking information about like where the machine's going to fall, like in a side range in a subnet, for instance. And that's kind of the scope is very, you know, bottom infrastructure layer only, and we sort of stop at the software layer.
Yeah, so I think the interesting intersection here would be, where does the cloud provider specific code go in the cluster API? And if we can have some consistency in the way we manage the structure of that, I think it would be useful.
I completely agree. I think we're solving a lot of the same problems. You know, everything from like, how do we interface out the infrastructure bits so that they work for every cloud? And, you know, what do we concern ourselves with and what do we prescribe? Or how does the code talk to the cloud specific bits? Do we like vendor that in? Is it part of the same binary? Do we stick them in the same pod? Do we use gRPC? Like, these are all questions that we're solving that I'm assuming you folks are also concerning yourself with as well. So like working together, again, like I think is a kind of a win-win for both of us.
Yeah, so to dive a little bit more into the technical details there. So I think a couple months ago, we talked about handling or like extending node conditions or node states. One example being that, some providers support nodes being shut down, and we don't really handle shutdown states. Like it just like the node is just down. It's just not ready. And so like if we want to support some of those like unique states per provider, is that something we want the machines API to do eventually, or is that something that we still want like a node condition in the Kubernetes core API?
I mean, I think one of the things that we crossed early on was making an explicit move away from the node object. Nodes right now kind of work like backwards compared to the machine API, which nodes are like kind of read only. They sort of describe the state of a node, whereas the machine API is declarative and you say, this is what I intend to be there. I think long term, it would be cool if we could sort of munge the two together and actually make nodes declarative. I just don't know how like the politics behind getting that into core and what that's going to look like was sort of like a lot for us on day one. So that's why we sort of took a step away from nodes. But I think if we can, reasonably do it, I think everybody in the, working group would be on board for it.
Awesome.
I like the sidestep there of you became nodeless by being only machine focused.
Yeah, I learned that trick from Justin.
Well played.
But yeah, it was like, we already had a lot to chew on as a working group, just stepping into the boundary. We were like, let's call it something else and just do our own thing.
Words matter, it turns out, right?
Yeah. And also, if you talk to Tim Hawken and a couple other folks, the notion of a master in a node is like, I think the long-term intent is for those two concepts to kind of go away and everything sort of becomes this nebulous machine or whatever word you want to use there. And you can sort of describe each one independently.
Okay, so is there material that this group might look to that you could share for current state and trending direction, or places where we could have some folks take a look at how you're organizing cloud provider specific code?
Sure. So we don't really have like a formal roadmap that documents, what's on the agenda and goals or anything like that. We'll probably be there soon. We just now started like an office hours meeting. We have our SIG notes, and in the meantime, I'm happy to sort of commit myself to just being a spokesperson on behalf of the Cluster API to join this call and just sort of act as a liaison between the two groups.
Thank you. That would be super helpful. If there's even just an email or a general one-pager, something that just describes how the Cluster API behaves and is implemented in a couple different implementations, that might be useful for some folks on this.
So if you click on, sorry, I can't type very much because I have a broken hand right now, but if you click on the GitHub repo that I put in the agenda, there's a pretty decent diagram, and the README is pretty, like, it kind of gives a holistic view of the API, which I think is a horrible name, by the way, but of the project in general. What we're building is more or less a framework, and the actual API definition is one component of the framework.
Okay, excellent. I was just trying to make it a bit more actionable for folks on this call, that's all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If the README is not enough, I'm happy to like put together an email and send it out to this SIG.
Yeah, and if there's anything that we can do to help the membership, get involved with what your SIG is doing, because I'm sure that there are people here who maybe this is news to them and they want to go back to their organizations and decide if it's something that they want to start contributing to, to help, with those collaborations. We're happy to, people want repositories, and, I think, working with you there to help like vet cloud providers, and, I think that kind of falls into a lot of the scope that we're doing too. And so we're happy to help out on any of that where we can.
Okay. Yeah, I definitely think a more scalable solution long-term is going to be figuring out a better way for the two groups to sort of make sure that we're working well together. I just don't know. I don't have a good solution for that right now.
I have a quick technical question while you're here.
Sure.
Do you expect that long-term everything will use kind of like the same tooling with the local VM for bootstrapping, or is it reasonable for a tool to consume the like the cluster API as like the definition of a cluster and not necessarily use that bootstrapping system?
Great question. So the cluster API, when we originally sort of like were thinking about this, we looked at it. There's a couple of other open source projects that do Kubernetes infrastructure in a declarative way. The two sort of extremes to draw the scale was on one hand, we had a very prescriptive way of saying this is exactly like the shell commands you run to configure your nodes. And then the other side of the scale being like, we don't concern ourselves with that whatsoever. And we just say Kubernetes version 1.10, right? And then, the controller decides everything else. The cluster API decided it was sort of more like, what's the word I'm thinking of? Idiomatic to go in like more Kubernetes-like to go with a sort of like as small as possible API definition. So if you actually look at the code, it's very like you get to describe a version and like a name, and that's those are like the main components that you're going to be describing. And then you have a provider config, which is like the cloud specific stuff, and then the controller itself should be responsible for reasoning about how to make all that happen. So that's where like sort of the boundary lies. And then we've discovered that there's a lot of folks who want to configure nodes in the same way, so that we're working on some common code for like we have like an SSH provisioner that like allows you to like open up an SSH connection and then like go and actually run some shell commands arbitrarily, and then your controller can vendor that like piece of common code if you decide to.
Thanks.
Totally.
So you said the cluster API is in alpha right now. Do you know when you guys are planning to go beta?
I don't think we really necessarily have a time in mind. We're pushing towards it. We're still crossing a few major hurdles. Just today, our SIG calls are like a couple hours ago, so it's every Wednesday. Just today, we brought up a pretty fundamental change, which was switching from an aggregated API server over to to CRDs. So I think once we kind of hammer out some more of these details, we're going to look at what it means and what it's going to take for us to move to a formal beta.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Sure. And then I don't know if I'm going over time yet or not.
Yeah, I think that was about 10 minutes. Anyone else have questions about Cluster API?
And feel free to ping me offline or join the Slack channel, and I can do my best to help like get folks involved who are involved with whatever components you're wondering about.
Thanks, and I hope your hand heals quickly.
All right. Next up is Docs update. Nishi and Chris.
Hey, Chris, do you want to go first? Do you want
Nishi, why don't you take it? It's pretty loud in the room I'm in right now, so I think you can take the lead on this.
Okay, so last time we had an action item to create a KEP that would make it compulsory for all the cloud providers to maintain documentation for both in-tree and out-of-tree cloud controller managers. So basically, we took the KEP format and wrote down a proposal of what every cloud provider needs to provide with every release. And we just listed goals around creation of documentation and maintaining the developer documentation, and ultimately having the documentation consistent enough that SIG docs can confidently link to the SIG cloud provider documentation. So we just put it in a structure that is a proposal from our side. And before I open the PR, I wanted to get reviews done. And so that's my ask. If folks could just review it and leave comments, that'll be awesome. Is that good enough? I don't know what else I can add.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
If you look at the kind of what we're asking, everything may not be widely applicable to all of the providers. Like not all of the cloud providers have in-tree, have an in-tree provider in place. So it wouldn't make sense to, you have nothing to document, and so you wouldn't document that. Likewise, if your out-of-tree provider isn't available yet, then that's not something that you would that you would document. But the idea is that there's in-tree code and there's out-of-tree code. Typically, they're very similar, so a lot of the docs will be similar. But there are differences in how the providers are loaded if you're out of tree, and so we're going to try to capture the things that are similar, like the flags that you pass to kubelet to be able to load the entry provider or to load the cloud control manager, and then the sort of things you need to do to be able to pull in the external provider and make sure that's loaded, and some of the caveats with it, load ordering and those things to make capture the similar things, and then requiring all the cloud providers to make sure that they document the very specific things for their particular system. And our goal with this, once the KEP is approved, is to really have everyone producing documentation again by the end of the 1.12 cycle, and to have that fall within the regular cadence of the SIG docs team and the release team, so that the documentation is in place by the deadline, and we have the reviews going, and it's kind of like trying to maintain as much parity with upstream main development as possible.
Yeah, I think with documentation, two of the biggest things that are lacking right now is like what flags you need to set for every component, and what all the different annotations mean and how they correlate to the different features. Load balancers being a good example. And I think pretty much what the KEP has proposed right now is a pretty good kind of first iteration of those two things. So I think it's a pretty good start.
Cool. And I have used AWS examples just to give an idea of what needs to happen for initialization of the kubelet API server and the kube controller manager in tree and out of tree. Some of that manifest needs to be tested. Before I write the PR, I will test the manifest and give the examples. But this is supposed to be a proposal and a format, so I would really appreciate if folks can just read it and give me feedback before I open the PR. And our goal is to open the PR by early next week.
Thanks for your work on this, Nishi and Chris. Appreciate it.
Not a problem.
Sorry, once I'm just writing notes down. All right, is Walter in this call?
Walter is not in this call or available to be here today, but the next item on the agenda is his PR to move some the cloud providers to staging there. So if folks can please take a look at that, provide feedback, any concerns, please list them in there, or reach out to Chef Taco on, I think, also Slack, but certainly GitHub. Taco with a K, of course.
Yeah, and so to give a quick overview of that, we essentially want to move everything in package/cloud providers/providers into Kubernetes/staging/ package/cloud providers. And this is just a way for us to signal to the community that we want to move these out, but we still want to keep it in Kubernetes core, because trying to pull that out is going to break a lot of things if we just do it at once. So this is kind of like a staging period. We don't know how long it's going to be in staging for. It could be a while, but this is a good start. So yeah, please review that.
So Andrew, is that an action item before our next call on the providers to provide on the PR?
Yes. So the thing is, like, I was hoping Walter would give an update on if that, because there were some comments and I don't think he revisited that PR and made updates. He did mention that he was going to pull the staging, like the initiative to move the code into a staging directory. He said he was going to put it into a separate proposal. I don't think he got to that. So I'm not sure. It seems like we're a bit blocked on that.
So let me walk by and kick his shin later today and make sure that he updates that, and have him email the mailing list when it's time to give a real review. How's that sound?
Sounds great. Thank you. Let me add that to the agenda. Cool. Awesome, thanks. Okay, next is load balancer's name should be more meaningful. So I've been digging through some of the load balancer code recently, and it turns out that for every provider, we pretty much assign the service UUID as the load balancer name, which means if you create a load balancer, it'll just have this completely meaningless name that, which I think the main reason we did this is because we know that the UUID will be unique, and we know that the name will be compatible with pretty much every provider. But it also causes a lot of confusion. So for DigitalOcean, I've at least had 5 issues opened about the load balancer name being not very helpful, and if there's any way to override it, and pretty much there's not much we can do because we kind of directly depend on the upstream code. So I was kind of wondering if people had ran into this issue before, and if there were any previous discussions around this at all.
I don't actually know. My first stop would be to ask Tim Hawken why and how, and if there's background and context on it has to be that way for this reason or that reason. Sometimes there is, and sometimes it's just, I don't know, it just happened out of nowhere.
Yeah, so he actually opened an issue to update it. So I think the status of, so I think the current state is that no one likes the way it's named, but no one wants to change it because breaking the load balancer code is going to be really bad. So we're just kind of stuck in this state where like, this is just the way it is. It's working, the naming sucks, but like no one wants to do anything about it.
Is there a way to update it without breaking it? Like, you know, it uses the default behavior, but if you add information, it will, you know, it'll choose a name instead of the UUID, or is it more deeply embedded than that?
Adding a nice name or something.
Yeah, so I think that's one solution, but it's still not, like, it's not trivial. Like every provider is sort of different, and like I think that's a reasonable solution. I think we should just do that. It's just a matter of like actually putting in the work, making sure that we're testing it properly and that we're not deleting anyone's load balancers. So does anyone want to take this task?
I just wanted to provide perspective from AWS. I know that I've seen issues similarly about the load balancer names being cryptic. And yeah, I think people are annoyed. Another unrelated but semi-related issue for AWS is our node name, which is currently stuck at private DNS. So not the same issue, but a similar pain point.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the node names. That's probably a hard one to change too.
Yeah, probably even more difficult.
And we've been struggling with that too. How to handle node names. We've actually made changes to our code and then reverted them back because it was wrong. We did the wrong things.
Okay, so I guess for actionable items here, I'm just gonna kind of put the issue out in the open and see if there's any takers. If there isn't, I guess next SIG meeting we can talk about it, and I don't know, maybe I'll take it or something. But yeah, I've just seen too many issues about this. I just want to fix it, and I don't think it's ideal to have random names like the ones we have right now for load balancers. Cool. Okay, so I think that's it for the SIG meeting. Is there any other topic that anyone wants to bring up? Cool. I think we can end early. All right, thanks guys.
Thank you.
Thanks
everybody.
Bye.
Folks. Bye.